Okay, let's look at the shape of the budget constraint when we introduced items like food subsidies and food stamps. Let's start with the story of food stamps. So if we have an initial income for this family of $1,000, what this says is that they can either spend all $1,000 on Dukes, which is just a composite of all the different options of things I can have other than whatever I put on the x-axis, in this case, food. So we can envision spending either all our money on food, but not having any money left over for rent or car payments or gas, or all our money on Dukes, but not having any food. We know that consumers don't choose those two things, and so we know they're going to be somewhere at a point of tangency. And so if they spend, let's say, $500 on food, that leaves them exactly $500, or their $1,000 of income minus $500 expenditure on food gives them 500 units of Dukes. You draw an indifference curve that's convex to the origin, downward sloping, and just tangent at that point. Now, what happens when we introduce something like a food subsidy? If we introduce a $200, food stamp, how does that change our budget constraint for this family? Well, what you do is you kind of say, all right, if I spend all my money on food, do I get more units of food? I'm just going to scoot this over here so I have more space. Okay. Yes, I can have, in fact, my $1,000 worth of food plus my $200 food stamp. That gives me a total consumption level of 1,200 units of food. So you can envision a grocery basket full of $1,200 of food. But if I spend all my money on Dukes, I don't get any more Dukes, but I do get to consume some quantity of food up till 200 units without having to make a trade-off between Dukes and food. And so we end up getting a kinked budget constraint. I'm just gonna change that dot. And that kinked budget constraint represents our budget constraint under a world where there's food stamps, okay? BC food stamps. And so what this says is that right here at 1,000, at 200 and 1,000, it says that I'm not forced to make a trade-off between rent and utilities and food. I can have both $1,000 worth of Dukes and $200 worth of food without having to sacrifice my consumption of food until I want more than 200 units of food. The cost of this program, of course, would be $200 per family, and we show that graphically by looking at the difference between these two endpoints, and this would be the cost of this food stamp plan. Okay, now let's go over here. What we see is that under a different set of conditions where we want to subsidize food, so this is a subsidy of food. Looks like my purple is running low. Let's go to blue. So we're going to subsidize food. Well, we know from our analysis of subsidies that the quantity of food consumed goes up, and the price of food under a world where we're subsidizing goes down, right? And so it's going to do something to this budget constraint. We're going to see that if we spend all our money on Dukes, we don't get any more Dukes, but if we spend all our money on food, we in fact get more units of food. And so how much more depends on how large that price decrease of food is, but we know in general that's what's going to happen. And so I'm actually going to take a second to just draw my initial budget constraint tangent to my initial indifference curve, just like we did before. And so let's call that U naught. So now I have this new budget constraint, and it represents a rotation because this is just a change in price, not effective income. And so I'm going to rotate out, and I'm going to call this BC subsidy. This is the budget constraint under the subsidy. We know all the realms of possibility are somewhere between here and here. But we also know the law of demand holds. And so what this says is that actually we expect, because the price of food went down, we expect that consumers will consume more food. And so they're probably going to end up somewhere in this realm. And so for right now, before we introduce substitution and income effects, we're going to choose that point. And so I'm going to draw an indifference curve that's convex to the origin, parallel to U naught. I know I'm happier, but how much does it cost the US government? And to find that, this is a little bit trickier. Maybe I'll call this point B and this point A. So what I want to do is I want to find the budget constraint that represents our effective increase in income that has happened because we're shopping in a world where the price of food is highly subsidized. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a ruler. Here, I'll take a piece of paper. I'm going to line it up with my original budget constraint, and I'm going to shift it out until I get to a point where it's going through point B. So dot, 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 dot. Okay, these lines are parallel. The endpoints of these lines represent the cost of the subsidy program, which is highly dependent on how much more consumers choose to consume in this world where we're subsidizing. If they consumed a lot more, it would cost the US government a lot more in return. And so this sort of is a nice summary of both the idea of kinked budget constraints and how we measure the cost of government programs. Hopefully that helps you get through a little bit more of consumer theory.